The morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Jackson Reed's penthouse office, illuminating the Manhattan skyline beyond. At 42, Jackson had everything most men could only dream of. Reed Enterprises, valued at billions. Properties spanning 3 continents, a collection of rare sports cars, and until recently, a wife he had once believed was perfect. Jackson straightened his custom Italian suit and glanced at the divorce papers his attorney had just delivered. The ink had barely dried. 6 months since the proceedings began. 1 year since he'd made the decision that would alter both their lives forever. "Congratulations, Mr. Reed," his attorney, Maxwell Porter, said while closing his leather briefcase. "The settlement was generous but clean. Mrs. Reed, pardon me, Ms. Victoria Bennett has relinquished all claims to Reed Enterprises. She keeps the Hamptons property and the agreed-upon settlement." Jackson nodded, his expression unreadable. "Thank you, Max. That will be all." After the attorney left, Jackson swiveled his chair toward the windows. Victoria had been his partner for 8 years, supporting him through the early struggles of building Reed Enterprises from a promising startup to a technology empire. They had planned their future meticulously. The empire, the legacy, the children who would one day inherit it all. But after 4 years of marriage and countless fertility treatments, specialists across the country delivered the same verdict. Victoria couldn't conceive. The company phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. "Mr. Reed, your brother is here to see you." "Send him in." Daniel Reed entered the office with his characteristic easy stride. 5 years younger than Jackson, he served as the company's chief operating officer and, more importantly, as Jackson's conscience when he needed one most. "So it's done?" Daniel asked, settling into a chair opposite Jackson's desk. "It's done," Jackson confirmed. "Victoria gets the Hamptons house and 50 million. More than fair." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Fair? Is that what we're calling it now?" "Don't start, Daniel. The decision was mutual." "Was it?" "Because I remember Victoria begging you to consider adoption. I remember her suggesting surrogacy. I remember her loving you enough to offer divorce when you insisted on having biological children." Jackson's jaw tightened. "I built all of this to create a legacy. My company, my blood. And now you have your freedom to find someone who can give you heirs," Daniel said, his voice tinged with disappointment. "Meanwhile, I wonder how Victoria's doing with her freedom." "She'll be fine. Victoria's resilient." Jackson shuffled papers on his desk, signaling an end to the conversation. "Now, about the Thompson merger. 6 months passed. Jackson dated casually. Beautiful, accomplished women who would make suitable mothers for his future children. None captured his interest beyond a few dinners. Meanwhile, Reed Enterprises thrived, expanding into new markets across Asia. On a crisp autumn morning, Jackson's assistant knocked on his door. "Mr. Reed, there's something you should see." She handed him the latest issue of New York Business Monthly. The magazine featured promising entrepreneurs, and there on page 36 was Victoria. The photograph showed her in profile, dressed in an elegant maternity dress, her hand resting protectively over a prominent baby bump. The headline read, "Victoria Bennett, from corporate wife to startup sensation." Jackson felt the room spin. Victoria was pregnant. How was that possible? The specialists had been unanimous in their diagnosis. He scanned the article, learning that Victoria had launched a successful tech platform for connecting families with adoption resources. The article mentioned she was expecting her first child, but offered no details about the father. That evening, Jackson found himself parked outside Victoria's new Manhattan apartment building. He'd called Daniel earlier, demanding answers. "Did you know Victoria was pregnant?" he'd asked without preamble. There was a long pause before Daniel replied, "Yes." "How? Who?" "The doctor said." "Maybe you should ask her yourself," Daniel had suggested. So here he was, sitting in his Bentley like some lovesick teenager instead of a billionaire CEO. Finally, he gathered his courage and approached the doorman. "I'm here to see Victoria Bennett." The doorman's eyes widened in recognition. "Mr. Reed, I'll need to call up first." After a brief conversation, the doorman nodded. "Ms. Bennett will see you. Penthouse B." The elevator ride felt eternal. Jackson rehearsed what he might say, but all thoughts vanished when Victoria opened the door. She wore a simple dress that accentuated her 7-month pregnancy. Her chestnut hair was shorter now, framing her face in soft waves. Her green eyes, always her most striking feature, regarded him cautiously. "Jackson," she said simply, stepping aside to let him enter. The apartment was tastefully decorated in warm tones, so different from the sleek, modern aesthetic of their shared home. Photos lined the walls, Victoria with her parents, with friends, but none with Jackson. "You look well," he offered awkwardly. "Thank you," she replied, settling carefully onto a sofa. "What brings you here after all this time?" Jackson gestured helplessly at her belly. "I saw the magazine. Victoria, how is this possible? The doctors said that I couldn't conceive," she finished for him. "Yes, that's what they said." "Then how?" he began, his mind racing through possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. Had she been unfaithful during their marriage? Had the doctors been wrong? Or had she simply met someone else immediately after their separation? Victoria sighed, rubbing her belly absently. "It's complicated, Jackson. I have time," he insisted, sitting across from her. Victoria studied him, as if weighing how much to reveal. "After you asked for the divorce, I was devastated. Not just because our marriage was ending, but because I felt like a failure as a woman." She paused. "I decided to try one last experimental treatment that my doctor had mentioned. It was a long shot, something not covered by insurance. I never told you, because by then you had already decided to move on." Jackson felt a stab of guilt. "And it worked?" "Not exactly," Victoria said, her expression unreadable. "Jackson, there's something you need to know." A key turned in the lock and the front door swung open. "Vicky, I brought that ice cream you were craving and—" The man stopped short when he saw Jackson. Jackson stood, shock washing over him as he recognized the newcomer. It was Thomas Wilson, Victoria's doctor, the fertility specialist who had delivered the final verdict on Victoria's condition just over a year ago. "Mr. Reed," Thomas said stiffly, placing the grocery bags on a nearby counter. "This is unexpected." Jackson looked between Victoria and Thomas, the implications hitting him like a physical blow. Had they been involved while he and Victoria were still married, while Thomas was treating them? "I think you should leave," Thomas said quietly, moving to stand protectively near Victoria. "Jackson," Victoria began, her voice gentle but firm, "we have a lot to discuss, but not like this. Not tonight." Numb with confusion and betrayal, Jackson nodded. "I'll call you tomorrow," he managed to say before walking out, his mind reeling with questions that threatened to unravel everything he thought he knew about his failed marriage and the woman he had once loved. The next morning, Jackson sat in his home office staring at his untouched coffee as dawn broke over the city. He hadn't slept. The image of Victoria, pregnant, glowing, and somehow connected to Thomas Wilson, haunted him. He had trusted Wilson implicitly during those difficult years of fertility treatments. The doctor had been compassionate, yet clinical, delivering the devastating news that Victoria could never conceive with the grave certainty of medical expertise. Jackson's phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. "Did you talk to her?" He ignored it, reaching instead for his laptop. Within minutes, he was scanning Thomas Wilson's professional profile. The doctor had resigned from his prestigious fertility clinic 6 months ago, around the time Jackson's divorce was finalized, to pursue personal interests. Now he consulted part-time at a research hospital. Something didn't add up. When his doorbell rang at precisely 9 o'clock, Jackson wasn't surprised to find Victoria standing there. She wore a simple navy dress that complemented her pregnant silhouette, her face composed but wary. "May I come in?" she asked. Jackson stepped aside, leading her to the living room of his new penthouse, sleek, minimalist, and devoid of personal touches. Nothing like the warm home they had built together. "No Thomas today?" he asked, unable to keep the edge from his voice. Victoria sat carefully on the leather sofa. "I asked him to give us space. This conversation should be between us." "A conversation that should have happened months ago," Jackson countered, remaining standing. "How far along are you?" 7 months, she replied, meeting his gaze steadily. The timing sent Jackson's mind racing. 7 months? That would mean— "I conceived shortly after we separated," Victoria confirmed, "before the divorce was finalized." Jackson paced the room, processing this information. "And Thomas, how long has that been going on?" Victoria's eyes flashed with rare anger. "It's not what you think, Jackson. Thomas and I became close after you left." He supported me through the darkest period of my life, when my husband decided I was worthless because I couldn't give him children. I never said you were worthless, Jackson protested weakly. You didn't have to say it. Your actions spoke clearly enough. Victoria placed her hands protectively over her belly. Thomas and I didn't begin dating until 3 months after you filed for divorce. Jackson stopped pacing. So, the baby isn't his? Victoria's expression softened slightly. No. Thomas isn't the biological father. Relief flooded Jackson, followed immediately by confusion. Then who? A donor? Victoria hesitated, studying him as if deciding how much to reveal. Jackson, do you remember our last IVF attempt? The one right before you asked for separation? Of course, it failed like all the others. She shook her head slowly. It didn't exactly fail. We had 3 viable embryos. You were traveling for the Beijing deal, so I went to the appointment alone. Dr. Wilson Thomas informed me that the embryos were healthy, but that my body would likely reject them as it had the others. Jackson lowered himself into an armchair across from her, listening intently. He proposed an experimental protocol, something he'd been researching. It wasn't approved for general practice yet, but he believed it might work for cases like mine. Victoria's voice grew quieter. By then I knew our marriage was crumbling. You were distant, staying later at the office, taking more business trips. I was desperate to save what we had, so I agreed to try the protocol without telling you. You made that decision without me? Jackson asked, his voice tight. You had made it clear that you were done with failed experiments, as you called them, Victoria replied. Besides, this was my body, my last chance. I had nothing to lose. The implication of her words slowly dawned on him. Are you saying? The embryo was ours, Jackson, created from your sperm and my egg during our last IVF cycle. The experimental protocol involved a new immunosuppressive approach combined with hormonal therapy. Thomas monitored me closely, adjusting treatments when needed. When you asked for divorce 2 weeks later, I didn't even know if the procedure had worked. Jackson felt the room tilt. The baby is mine. Ours. Victoria nodded, tears forming in her eyes. Biologically, yes. I found out I was pregnant the day your lawyer sent the initial divorce papers. By then you had made your position clear. You wanted out, wanted to find someone who could give you children. The irony was unbearable. Why didn't you tell me? Jackson demanded, his voice rising. You let me sign those papers thinking what? Victoria cut in. That you were free to find a more fertile woman? That's what you wanted, wasn't it? And what would you have done if I had told you? Stayed out of obligation? Questioned if the baby was really yours? Accused me of manipulation? She wiped away a tear. I couldn't bear to see doubt in your eyes. Not after everything we'd been through. The weight of her words struck him like physical blows. She wasn't wrong. In his hurt and disappointment, he might have questioned everything. Thomas knew about this? Jackson asked. He was my doctor, Jackson, and later he became the friend who held me together when my world fell apart. Victoria's hand moved in slow circles over her belly. He knew the baby was yours from the beginning. When we eventually developed feelings for each other, he accepted that this child would always connect me to you. Jackson leaned forward, elbows on knees, head in hands. His mind raced through implications, calculations, emotions he'd buried months ago. So Thomas is playing father to my child? Victoria stood abruptly. No one is playing anything. Thomas and I are building a life together, a life that includes this child, a child who exists because of a medical breakthrough, not because of your faith in me or our marriage. Victoria, Jackson began, his voice cracking. If I had known. You didn't want to know, she interrupted. You'd already decided that your legacy was more important than our love. Do you know what Thomas said when I told him about the pregnancy? He said I should make whatever choice felt right to me, that my happiness mattered most. He didn't once mention his reputation or legacy. Jackson stood to face her. I have rights. Legal rights, perhaps, but rights earned through commitment and love? Those you relinquished when you walked away. Victoria moved toward the door, then paused. I didn't come here to fight, Jackson. I came because you deserved to know the truth and because someday our daughter might want to know her biological father. A daughter? Jackson whispered, the word settling over him like a benediction. Victoria's expression softened momentarily. Yes, a perfectly healthy little girl due in December. Her hand rested on the doorknob. I'll have my lawyer contact yours to discuss how we move forward. In the meantime, I suggest you reflect on what kind of presence you want to have in her life, if any. As the door closed behind her, Jackson remained standing in the middle of his pristine, empty living room. The magnitude of what he'd lost and what he'd unexpectedly gained left him breathless. Not just Victoria, but the very thing he'd divorced her for being unable to provide. His child, his daughter, his legacy. And in his blind pursuit of that legacy, he had lost both. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of legal consultations and sleepless nights for Jackson. His attorney advised caution, DNA testing after birth, formalized visitation arrangements, clear financial boundaries. But these clinical discussions about parental rights felt hollow against the storm of emotions Jackson couldn't suppress. One rainy Thursday afternoon, Jackson found himself at Daniel's brownstone in Brooklyn. His brother opened the door, expression neutral but eyes wary. "I was wondering when you'd show up," Daniel said, ushering him inside. The warm interior contrasted sharply with the dreary weather. Photos of Daniel's family adorned the walls, children's toys were neatly stacked in a corner, and the scent of something home-cooked lingered in the air. "Did you know," Jackson demanded without preamble, "about Victoria's pregnancy, that the baby is mine?" Daniel sighed, leading Jackson to the kitchen where he poured 2 glasses of whiskey. "Sit down," he instructed. Jackson remained standing. "Answer me, Daniel." "Yes, I knew," Daniel admitted, taking a sip from his glass. "Victoria told me when she was 3 months along." "And you didn't think to mention this to me, your own brother?" Jackson's voice rose. "She swore me to secrecy, Jackson. She was terrified of your reaction, of losing the baby after coming so far, of everything crumbling again." Daniel set down his glass. "Besides, you seemed hell-bent on moving forward. How did dating those women who looked at you like you were a prize stallion rather than a man?" Jackson winced at the accuracy of his brother's assessment. He'd dated strategically after the divorce, women from good families with clean medical histories who spoke openly about wanting children. None had lasted more than a few weeks. "I had a right to know," Jackson insisted, finally dropping into a chair. "Maybe, but rights and deservedness aren't always the same thing." Daniel leaned against the counter. "What do you want now, Jackson, really want?" The question hung in the air. What did he want? To reclaim Victoria, to assert his paternal rights, to salvage some form of family from the wreckage of his decisions? "I don't know," he admitted finally. "But I know I can't just walk away from my child." Daniel nodded slowly. "Then you need to accept that Victoria has built a new life, one that doesn't revolve around you, and Thomas is part of that life." The mention of Thomas rekindled Jackson's anger. He was her doctor, our doctor. There must be some ethical violation. "Stop it," Daniel cut him off sharply. "Thomas didn't begin a relationship with Victoria until after your divorce was well underway, and he's been nothing but supportive of her. Unlike some people I could mention." Jackson rubbed his temples, feeling a headache building. "I need to talk to her again. Give her space, Jackson. The stress isn't good for her or the baby." Daniel's expression softened. "Besides, there's something else you should know." Jackson looked up warily. "What now?" "The experimental protocol Victoria underwent. Thomas developed it based on years of research. He'd been trying to get funding for clinical trials, but traditional channels were hesitant because the approach was considered too radical." Daniel paused. "Victoria's success case has changed that. She's not just a patient who beat the odds. She's become the face of breakthrough fertility treatment." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that Victoria and Thomas aren't just romantically involved. They've partnered professionally. The startup she launched, it's not just about adoption resources. It's evolved into a foundation that funds research for women with similar fertility challenges. Thomas provides the medical expertise. Victoria handles the business side and patient advocacy." Jackson processed this information slowly. Victoria had always been brilliant in business. It was one of the qualities that had first attracted him to her when she'd worked as a consultant for his fledgling company. Now she was channeling that brilliance into something deeply personal. "They're changing lives, Jackson," Daniel continued. "The protocol that worked for Victoria has now been successfully implemented for 7 other women who were previously told they couldn't conceive. Women who reminded Victoria of herself." For the first time, Jackson felt a glimmer of something beyond his own sense of betrayal and loss, a reluctant admiration for what Victoria and Thomas had built together. "How do you know all this?" he asked. Daniel hesitated. "Because I'm on the board of their foundation. I've invested in it." Jackson stared at his brother, feeling a fresh wave of betrayal. "You're funding them." "I'm supporting important medical research that's helping women who've been told they have no hope," Daniel corrected. "And yes, I'm supporting Victoria, who deserved better than what happened between you two." Jackson stood abruptly. "I need some air." Outside, the rain had intensified. Jackson walked aimlessly through Brooklyn streets, his expensive shoes splashing through puddles, his suit growing increasingly sodden. His mind replayed every moment with Victoria. Their first meeting, their wedding day, the gradual erosion of their happiness as fertility treatments failed, the cold calculation with which he'd eventually decided to cut his losses and move on. He'd justified it all in the name of legacy. Reed Enterprises needed an heir, his family name needed continuation, his success demanded genetic immortality. But standing in the rain, Jackson confronted an uncomfortable truth. His obsession with legacy had cost him the very legacy he now discovered he had. 3 days later, Jackson attended a charity gala benefiting medical research. He hadn't planned to go, but when he saw Victoria and Thomas listed as honorees, he couldn't stay away. He watched from across the ballroom as Victoria, radiant in a midnight blue maternity gown, accepted an award for philanthropic innovation. "The Wilson Bennett Foundation began with a personal journey," she said into the microphone, her voice steady and clear. "When I was told I could never have children, I accepted that as medical fact. But what I've learned is that never sometimes just means not yet. Not with current methods, not with existing protocols." She smiled, one hand resting on her belly. "Today, we're funding research that challenges those nevers and turns them into not yets for women everywhere." The crowd applauded enthusiastically. Thomas joined Victoria on stage, his arm slipping naturally around her waist as he took the microphone to explain the scientific breakthroughs their foundation supported. Watching them, Jackson felt an unexpected absence of jealousy. Instead, he saw two people united by purpose as much as by affection, the kind of partnership he and Victoria might have had if he hadn't reduced her value to her fertility. After the speeches, Jackson waited until Victoria stepped away from the crowd toward a quiet corridor. He approached cautiously, not wanting to startle her. "That was an impressive speech," he said softly. Victoria turned, surprise flickering across her face. "Jackson, I didn't know you'd be here." "I wasn't planning to come," he admitted. "But I wanted to see you." She regarded him cautiously. "Our lawyers are handling the arrangements. There's nothing more to discuss until after the birth." "I didn't come to talk about arrangements." Jackson took a deep breath. "I came to apologize." Victoria's eyebrows rose slightly. "Apologize? For everything? For reducing our marriage to a transaction? For walking away when things got difficult? For making you feel like your worth was tied to your ability to have children?" The words tumbled out, unplanned but sincere. "You deserved better, Victoria. You always did." She studied him silently, one hand absently stroking her belly. Finally, she said, "Why now, Jackson? Because you've discovered the baby is yours, because suddenly I have value again." Her words stung with their accuracy. "No," he said quietly, "because seeing you tonight, hearing you speak about turning nevers into not yets, made me realize how short-sighted I was, how much I missed by focusing only on what wasn't possible instead of what might be." Before Victoria could respond, Thomas appeared at her side, his expression guarded but not hostile. "Everything okay?" he asked, looking between them. Victoria nodded. "Fine, Jackson was just leaving." Thomas extended his hand to Jackson in a surprisingly civil gesture. "Mr. Reed." Jackson hesitated before shaking it. "Dr. Wilson." An awkward silence fell, broken when Victoria suddenly gasped, her hand flying to her side. "Victoria." Both men spoke simultaneously, moving toward her. She smiled, the tension momentarily forgotten. "She's kicking." Quite vigorously. Without thinking, Jackson asked, "May I?" His hand hovered uncertainly in the air. Victoria exchanged a glance with Thomas, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. She took Jackson's hand and placed it where the baby was moving. For a moment, the three adults stood frozen in a tableau of complicated emotions, as Jackson felt his daughter's movements for the first time. The tiny flutters against his palm made everything suddenly, overwhelmingly real. "I have something for her," Jackson said suddenly, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a small velvet box and handed it to Victoria. It was my grandmother's. Victoria opened the box to reveal a delicate gold locket, intricately engraved with flowering vines. "Jackson, my grandmother gave it to my mother when I was born," he explained. "It's meant to be passed down. I want our daughter to have it, regardless of everything else." Victoria's eyes glistened as she looked from the locket to Jackson. "Thank you." Thomas cleared his throat. "Victoria should rest. The doctor wants her off her feet as much as possible in these final weeks." Jackson nodded, stepping back. "Of course." He hesitated. "May I call you? To check how you're doing?" Victoria considered this, then nodded slowly. "Yes, you may." As Jackson watched them leave, Thomas's arm supportively around Victoria's waist, he felt something shift within him, a painful recognition of what he'd lost, tempered by the first fragile hope of what might still be possible. December arrived with unseasonable warmth, as if nature itself were easing the way for new beginnings. Jackson had maintained respectful distance while still checking in on Victoria regularly. Their conversations, initially strained and formal, had gradually softened. Victoria shared details about the pregnancy, the baby's strong heartbeat, her active movements, her apparent preference for classical music which calmed her kicking. Jackson attended the final ultrasound appointment at Victoria's invitation, standing awkwardly in the corner of the examination room while Thomas held her hand. Watching his ex-wife and her new partner share such an intimate moment was uncomfortable, but Jackson reminded himself that his presence was a privilege, not a right. "Would you like to know her name?" Victoria asked as they left the hospital. Jackson looked up in surprise. "You've decided?" Victoria nodded, exchanging a glance with Thomas. "We have." "We thought you should know before everyone else," Thomas added, his tone neutral but not unkind. Jackson appreciated the gesture, recognizing it as the olive branch it was. "I'd be honored." "Amelia," Victoria said softly. "Amelia Grace." "Amelia," Jackson repeated, feeling the name settle in his heart. "It's beautiful. It means industrious and striving," Thomas explained. Given how hard she fought to exist, it seemed fitting. Jackson nodded, unexpectedly moved by the thoughtfulness behind the name. "It's perfect." Later that week, Jackson invited Daniel and his wife for dinner at his penthouse. As they sipped wine in his rarely used dining room, Jackson shared his evolving feelings about the situation. "I've been thinking about legacy differently," he admitted. "About what it really means to leave something worthwhile behind." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "That's new for you." "I've had cause to reconsider many things." Jackson swirled the wine in his glass. "I'm stepping back from daily operations at Reed Enterprises." Daniel nearly choked on his drink. "You're what?" "Not permanently," Jackson clarified. "But I'm promoting Cassandra Martinez to interim CEO while I take some time away." "Cassie's brilliant," Daniel acknowledged. "But this is unexpected." "What are you planning to do?" Jackson took a deep breath. "I've established a new division within Reed Enterprises, the Amelia Initiative. It will partner with the Wilson Bennett Foundation to develop technologies that support their medical research." Daniel's wife, Rachel, leaned forward. "You're funding Victoria and Thomas's work." "More than funding," Jackson explained. "We're creating specialized equipment for fertility clinics, implementing their protocol. The foundation handles research and treatment development. We handle technology and implementation. It's a perfect synergy." Daniel studied his brother. "And Victoria agreed to this?" "She suggested it," Jackson replied. "We've been talking more frequently about the baby, yes, but also about possibilities neither of us had considered before." "Like what?" Daniel pressed. "Like the fact that sometimes the most meaningful legacy isn't just about passing on your genes, but about changing lives." Jackson set down his glass. "The protocol that worked for Victoria has now helped 15 women conceive. 15 families with children they thought they'd never have." Rachel smiled warmly. "That's incredible, Jackson." "And what about your relationship with Victoria?" Daniel asked cautiously. "Where does Thomas fit in all this?" Jackson's expression turned thoughtful. "We're finding our way towards something new, not a reconciliation. That door closed when I walked away. But perhaps a different kind of partnership." He paused. "Thomas is a good man. I've come to respect him, both as a doctor and as someone who stood by Victoria when I didn't." "That's surprisingly mature of you," Daniel remarked. Jackson laughed without humor. Trust me, it didn't come easily, but some lessons are worth the pain of learning them. 2 days later, Jackson was in a board meeting when his assistant interrupted with an urgent message. Victoria had gone into labor 3 weeks early. Without explanation to his stunned executives, Jackson bolted from the conference room. At the hospital, he found Thomas pacing the waiting area, his usual composure fractured by concern. "What happened?" Jackson demanded. "Her blood pressure spiked suddenly," Thomas explained, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "They're monitoring both of them closely, but the doctor decided it's safer to deliver now." Are they going to be okay?" Jackson asked, fear tightening his chest. "The prognosis is good, but there are always risks with premature delivery." Thomas's professional detachment slipped, revealing the worried partner beneath. "They've taken her for an emergency C-section." Jackson sank into a chair, feeling helpless. "What can I do?" Thomas hesitated, then sat beside him. "Wait with me. Victoria would want us both here when there's news." For the next hour, the two men who loved the same woman, in different ways, at different times, sat side by side in anxious silence, occasionally breaking it with worried questions neither could answer. Daniel and Rachel arrived, bringing coffee and quiet support. Finally, a doctor emerged, still in surgical scrubs. "Family of Victoria Bennett," both Jackson and Thomas stood immediately. "They're both stable," the doctor announced, smiling tiredly. "The baby is small, 5 pounds 4 ounces, but her lungs are well developed. Ms. Bennett is resting comfortably." Relief washed over Jackson so intensely that he had to grip the back of a chair for support. Thomas thanked the doctor, his voice thick with emotion. "When can we see them?" Thomas asked. "Ms. Bennett is being moved to recovery now. The baby is in the NICU for observation, which is standard procedure for premature deliveries. You can see them both shortly." Thomas turned to Jackson. "You should meet your daughter." Jackson shook his head. "You go first. You're Victoria's partner now. I'll wait." Thomas studied him for a moment, then nodded gratefully. When Thomas returned 30 minutes later, his eyes were red-rimmed, but his smile was radiant. "She's perfect, Jackson. Absolutely perfect. Victoria's asking for you." Jackson followed a nurse through sterile corridors to Victoria's recovery room. She looked exhausted but peaceful, propped against pillows, her face pale but serene. "Jackson," she greeted him softly. "She's here." He approached cautiously. "I heard. Congratulations, Victoria. Thomas says she's beautiful." "She is. She has your eyes." Victoria reached for his hand. "Thank you for coming." "I wouldn't be anywhere else," he assured her, surprised by how naturally their fingers intertwined. "Would you like to meet her?" Victoria asked. "The nurse can take you to the NICU." Jackson nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Following another nurse, he arrived at the neonatal intensive care unit, where tiny Amelia Grace Reed lay in an incubator, her miniature body connected to monitors that beeped reassuringly. "You can touch her through these openings," the nurse explained, indicating ports in the incubator's side. Gently, Jackson reached in and touched his daughter's hand. 5 perfect tiny fingers immediately curled around his index finger with surprising strength. Tears Jackson hadn't realized he was holding back spilled freely down his cheeks. "Hello, Amelia," he whispered. "I'm your father." In that moment, looking at the miracle he'd nearly missed because of his narrow definition of legacy, Jackson understood what truly mattered. Not the continuation of his name or his genetic material, but the love that had created this child, love that had persisted even when he'd turned away from it. Over the next days, as Victoria recovered and Amelia grew stronger, an unexpected harmony developed between the 3 adults. Thomas's medical expertise provided calm reassurance during anxious moments. Victoria's quiet strength anchored them all. And Jackson, to his own surprise, found himself settling into a role he'd never imagined. Not the conventional father he'd once envisioned, but something uniquely suited to their unconventional family. 3 months later, on a crisp spring morning, Jackson hosted a gathering at his Hamptons estate. The one Victoria had received in the divorce settlement and had insisted on returning to shared ownership for Amelia's sake. Friends and family gathered to celebrate Amelia's arrival and the successful expansion of the Wilson Bennett Foundation's work. Victoria found Jackson alone on the terrace, watching as Thomas proudly showed the baby to Daniel's children. "He's wonderful with her," Jackson acknowledged, genuine warmth in his voice. "He is," Victoria agreed. "And so are you, in your own way." Jackson turned to her. "I never thanked you properly." "For what?" "For not shutting me out completely, for allowing me to know her, to be part of her life." Victoria smiled, the afternoon sunlight catching in her hair. "Amelia deserves to know all the people who love her, and despite everything, I never doubted that you would love her completely." "I do," Jackson confirmed, "more than I thought possible. The partnership between Reed Enterprises and our foundation is exceeding expectations," Victoria mentioned, changing the subject slightly. 3 more clinics have implemented the protocol. 27 women are currently undergoing treatment. "Legacy," Jackson murmured. "Pardon. That's the legacy I was so desperate for," he explained. "Not just Amelia, though she's the heart of it, but all those families, all those children who will exist because you and Thomas refused to accept never as an answer." Victoria's expression softened. "We all contributed, Jackson. Your technology makes the treatment more accessible, more affordable. We're changing lives together. Together." The word held new meaning now, not as husband and wife, but as partners in something larger than themselves. Jackson watched as Thomas approached, Amelia cradled expertly in his arms. "I think someone wants her mother," Thomas said, carefully transferring the baby to Victoria. As Victoria cradled their daughter, Jackson felt a profound peace settle over him. His definition of family had expanded beyond blood ties and legal documents to encompass the complex, beautiful reality before him, his daughter, her mother, and the man who had helped bring her into the world. 3 people connected not by traditional bonds, but by love for a child and respect for each other. 6 months later, Jackson stood in the newly completed Amelia Center for Reproductive Innovation, surveying the state-of-the-art facility that housed both the Wilson Bennett Foundation's research division and Reed Enterprises' medical technology development team. The center represented the finest work of both organizations and the personal growth of all 3 adults who had created it. Victoria joined him, professional in a tailored suit but with maternal softness in her eyes, when she glanced at the photo of Amelia on her desk. "The board unanimously approved the expansion to London and Singapore," she reported. "We'll be helping women on 3 continents by next year." "Ambitious," Jackson remarked with admiration. "I learned from the best," she replied, a hint of their old camaraderie in her smile. Thomas entered with the latest research results, and the 3 settled into a comfortable discussion about next steps. Watching Victoria and Thomas exchange ideas, their passion for their work evident, Jackson felt no jealousy, only appreciation for the family they had all created, both personal and professional. Later, as Jackson held Amelia during her regular visit to his home, he marveled at how his greatest loss had ultimately led to his greatest gain, not in the way he had planned, not through the path he would have chosen, but through painful lessons in what truly constituted a meaningful legacy. In Amelia's trusting eyes, in the lives changed by their foundation, in the newfound wisdom that had reshaped his priorities, Jackson Reed had found something far more valuable than the narrow vision of legacy he had once pursued so relentlessly. He had found redemption,